At dawn on December 13, 1943, Second Lieutenant Philip Adair lifted his P-40 Warhawk off the runway in Assam, India, and climbed into thin, pale light. The air looked quiet at first, just haze and distance, until shapes began to form along the eastern horizon. A large raid was coming in fast, headed straight for Denjon Airfield. Denjon mattered more than most people would guess from its dusty perimeter and rough-looking facilities. It was a pipeline, not a landmark. Transport aircraft cycling in and out with fuel and supplies, maintenance crews working nonstop, and medical staff trying to keep wounded men alive after the last round of attacks. If the field was crippled, the damage wouldn't be limited to a few burned aircraft. It would slow the entire airlift system that fed operations across the region. In a place where logistics decided what could even be attempted, that kind of disruption was its own victory. Adair had flown enough missions to recognize what he was seeing. This wasn't a casual sweep or a small harassment run. The attackers were organized, confident, and protected. In the center were bombers, twin-engine aircraft built to deliver destruction, not to dogfight. Around them were fighters, sleek escorts ready to punish any Allied pilot who tried to get close. If the formation reached Denjon intact, the defenders on the ground would have only seconds to react before the bombs fell. The worst part was the timing. Adair was the only Allied fighter already in the air. Friendly aircraft could be scrambled, but scrambled still meant minutes. Minutes the bombers didn't need. He could shadow the raid and wait for reinforcements. That would be safer. It would also be useless if the raid arrived before help did. He checked what he had and what he didn't. The P-40 was tough, fast in a dive, and armed with .50 caliber guns that could shred an aircraft if the rounds landed where they needed to. But ammunition was limited. A few long bursts could empty his belts. And outnumbered didn't even begin to describe his situation. The raid included many aircraft. He was one. Doctrine would tell him to avoid a fight like this. Pilots were taught not to throw away a plane and a life on a gesture. Yet Adair understood the grim math of the moment. Doing nothing guaranteed damage on the ground. Doing something, even if it failed, at least had a chance to disrupt the bombing. He didn't need to destroy the raid by himself. He only needed to ruin its timing and formation enough that bombs would miss, hesitate, or scatter. So he chose the one move that could actually change the outcome. He climbed above the incoming aircraft, careful to stay out of obvious sight lines. He angled toward the sun where possible, using the brightness to mask his approach. Surprise was a fragile advantage. You could spend it only once, but if he spent it at the right moment, it could buy Denjon the time it needed. As the raid grew larger in his windscreen, Adair studied it like a pattern. Bombers were most dangerous when they were calm, aligned, and confident. When they flew straight and level with clean spacing. A well-formed bombing run allowed crews to concentrate on aim, altitude, and release. Break that structure, and you break the strike. Even without kills, you could force crews to jettison early, drop wide, or abandon the run entirely. That was the objective. He positioned himself above and behind the lead group, then rolled his Warhawk into a diving attack. The aircraft accelerated quickly. The engine's roar deepened, the cockpit vibration changed, and the bombers swelled from distant silhouettes into detailed shapes. Wings, engines, glass noses, gun positions. The raid still hadn't reacted properly. They expected resistance closer to the target, not a sudden strike from a lone fighter out of the sun. Adair opened fire at close range. The P-40's guns hammered, and tracer rounds stitched across the nearest bomber. Almost immediately, smoke poured from an engine. The bomber began to lose its clean alignment. That single disruption did what Adair needed it to do. It forced movement. Bombers shifted, crews ducked, gunners fired, and spacing broke. The formation was no longer a stable platform for precise bombing. It became a set of aircraft trying to survive. Adair pulled up and rolled away, refusing to fly straight in front of multiple gun positions. He did not linger to admire damage. He was already thinking about the next pass. But as he repositioned, he saw the escorts reacting. Fighters peeled down toward him in fast arcs, turning the sky into a trap. Now the second phase began. A P-40 could not win a slow-turning duel against highly maneuverable escorts. Adair knew that if he bled off speed, he would be surrounded and cut apart. His only chance was to fight with energy, diving, climbing, and choosing when to engage, never allowing the enemy to dictate the shape of the fight. A rational pilot might have used the P-40's speed to extend away and escape, but escape would have delivered the bombers to Denjon in a few minutes. Adair stayed close, forcing the raid to keep dealing with him. Every second the escorts chased him was a second they weren't calmly screening the bombers. Every second bombers maneuvered defensively was a second their bombing solution fell apart. The first escorts tried to drag him into tight circles. Adair refused. He dove to keep speed, climbed only when safe, and used short, controlled bursts to make enemies break off rather than committing to long firing. He wasn't looking for a clean dogfight. He was doing something harsher and more exhausting. He was trying to keep a whole raid unstable. From the ground, it would have looked chaotic. One fighter weaving among many, bursts of gunfire, aircraft flashing past in different directions. In the cockpit, Adair's decisions were brutally simple. Don't slow down. Don't fly straight. Don't let them line up a shot. Hit the bombers when an opening appears. Then escape the immediate danger and do it again. And he did it again. He cut back toward the bomber stream, fired at another aircraft in the formation, then broke away before escorts could pin him. The bombers began to scatter even more. A formation built for accuracy was being forced into survival maneuvers. That was the difference between a controlled strike and a desperate drop. The raid still had numbers. It still had momentum. But it had lost something more important: confidence and structure. And for Denyon Airfield, that loss could mean the difference between a runway that burned and a runway that kept operating. Adair came out of his first attack run with the sky suddenly crowded. The escorts had fully committed now, peeling off the bomber stream to hunt him down. The pressure was immediate, fighters angling in from different heights, trying to box him into a turning fight where their tighter radius would finish the job. In a P-40, that was exactly how you died. Slow, trapped, and predictable. So Adair did the opposite. He kept his Warhawk fast and vertical. When an escort tried to sit behind him, he dove to build speed. When two fighters tried to cut across his path, he climbed just enough to slip out of their preferred angle, then rolled back down again. He was not outturning them. He was denying them a clean shot by refusing to stay in any one plane of motion for long. Every decision was made with one question: Does this keep me alive long enough to disrupt the bombing run again? The bombers were still heading toward Denjon, but now the formation looked less like a parade and more like a shaken herd. Some aircraft were tightening up in fear. Others were drifting, trying to avoid becoming the next target. Their gunners had begun firing sporadically at any movement, which made the bomber stream even less stable. It was a good sign. A bomber crew that is calm can aim and communicate. A bomber crew that is panicking sprays bullets and breaks formation. Adair used that instability like a lever. He needed openings. Openings in a raid like this don't happen by accident. They happen when escorts overcommit to chasing the attacker. And the escorts were overcommitting, because a lone fighter was an insult. It shouldn't have been able to interfere. That annoyance turned into aggression, and that aggression created gaps. When he saw one of those gaps, Adair rolled his P-40 back toward the bomber line. The move was dangerous because it meant flying toward the heaviest concentration of enemy aircraft. But it was the only way to make his presence matter. A fighter that simply survives has no impact. A fighter that survives and forces the bombers to abandon accuracy changes the outcome. He lined up from above again, using altitude to convert into speed. He didn't choose the nearest bomber. He chose the one that looked most central, the one whose movement would ripple through others. Then he fired in a short, hard burst and watched for the immediate reaction. The bomber shuddered, and its line began to drift. More importantly, the aircraft around it reacted, adjusting spacing, weaving, changing their own stability. That's what Adair needed. Secondary effects. The escorts reacted instantly. One fighter dove toward him from his left, another tried to cut him off from below. Adair snapped into a steep dive. The P-40's weight, often a disadvantage in a slow turn, became useful here. In the dive, it built speed quickly and held it. The horizon tilted, the engine note climbed, and the fighters behind him had to decide whether to follow into a high-speed chase or break off and return to the bombers. Some followed. Adair used that. He didn't have to win against them. He just had to keep them busy. If an escort was chasing him, it wasn't protecting the bombers. If multiple escorts chased him, the bomber screen weakened. He pulled them away from the bomber stream like a magnet, then climbed back toward the bombers the moment he saw them hesitate. This became the rhythm. Strike, dive, drag escorts away, climb back, strike again. It was exhausting, because it required constant energy management. You could not rest in a straight line without becoming a target. You could not stall in a climb without being cut down. Every motion had to be planned seconds in advance, because the enemy's next move would arrive faster than you could think if you waited too long. Adair also had to fight his own limitations. Ammunition. Each pass burned bullets, and bullets were time. He could not spray. He could not waste. He had to fire only when the angles were right and the distance was short enough for a burst to matter. That constraint made his attacks sharper. He aimed for engines and critical sections, not for hits that would only scar metal. Meanwhile, the raid's objective, Denyon, was getting closer. On the ground, crews likely heard the distant drone of engines and expected the worst. Adair didn't know what ground defenses were ready, or whether more Allied fighters were minutes away or already scrambling. He didn't have the luxury of that information. His world was the sky in front of him, the bomber's alignment, and the escort's movement. He could see changes that told him his work was having an effect. The bombers were no longer flying a clean, level track. Some had dropped altitude slightly. Others were climbing or weaving. That kind of movement ruins bombing accuracy, because bombs require stable release conditions. Even if a crew held their nerve, the aircraft itself was no longer steady enough for a precise run. The escorts, frustrated, tried new tactics. Instead of all chasing him, some began hovering near the bombers, attempting to bait him into a close approach, while others waited to pounce. Adair adjusted. He refused to commit to a shallow, straight attack that would put him in the center of their trap. He used feints, starting a dive toward the bombers, forcing escorts to react, then breaking away before they could converge. The goal was the same: keep them reacting, keep the bombers uneasy, keep the timing off. At one point, he pushed in close enough that bomber gunners opened up in multiple directions. Tracer lines crossed like wire. Adair slipped through, fired a short burst, then rolled out so hard the G-forces made the cockpit feel like it weighed twice as much. He didn't wait to see the full result. He only needed to know that the bomber line had shifted again, that the raid was still spending effort on him instead of on Denyon. By now, the fight wasn't about one plane versus many. It was about whether one determined pilot could impose enough disorder on a raid to steal its effectiveness. Adair's Warhawk wasn't invisible anymore. It was the single most distracting thing in the air, and he kept it that way. Adair's fuel and ammunition were quietly turning into a countdown. In the moment, you don't feel a timer ticking, but you feel the edges of it. The growing discipline in your trigger finger, the way you start measuring whether a climb is worth the energy, the way you stop thinking in opportunities and start thinking in musts. He still had the initiative only as long as he had speed, altitude, and bullets to spend. The escorts were learning too. Early in the engagement, they had chased him like a swarm, certain that numbers alone would finish the problem. Now their moves carried more intent. They began dividing their roles. Some stayed near the bomber stream to keep the protective ring intact, while others swept wider, trying to cut off the angles Adair needed for another attack. They wanted him either driven away or forced into a bad choice: commit to the bombers and get trapped, or stay safe and lose influence. Adair refused to pick the safe option, but he also refused to pick the obvious option. Instead of coming straight down behind the bombers again, he shifted laterally and climbed into a position that gave him a cross angle. He wasn't trying to be clever for style. He was trying to be unpredictable. Bombers could defend themselves to a point, but their real protection came from escorts anticipating where the attacker would appear. If Adair could appear where they didn't expect, he could strike with less immediate danger. He rolled into a dive from that new angle. The bomber line, already uneasy, reacted almost instantly. Some aircraft began to weave, others tightened up, and gunners swung their weapons toward him. He fired a controlled burst at close range, then broke downward and away, before the escort screen could close. Behind him, fighters snapped into pursuit. Adair felt the familiar pull, the temptation to turn and fight them directly, to prove something, to win the moment. But he didn't need a duel. He needed time. So he dove again, forcing the pursuers to either follow into a high-speed chase or break and return to their mission. A few followed too long. That mattered. Every escort chasing him was an escort not available to stabilize the bomber formation. Adair used the pursuit like a rope, stretching it away from the bombers. When the fighters finally broke off to return, they were temporarily out of position. That created another gap. He climbed back toward the bombers, careful not to bleed too much speed. He was flying on the edge of what the P-40 could do well: diving attacks and energy management. He kept his turns wide, his climbs measured. He never lingered in the bomber gun envelope. He approached, fired, and escaped. Again and again. The bombers were now close enough to Denjan that their crews would be thinking about release points. That should have made them more determined, more focused. Instead, they were still spending that focus on survival. Their neat approach had dissolved into a series of corrections, each correction triggered by the threat of Adair's attacks. That constant correction meant no clean line. No clean line meant no clean drop. He saw a bomber, slightly separated, a fraction low, and off to the side. An aircraft that looked like it had taken damage or was simply struggling to keep the pace. It was a tempting target. One more hard pass could finish it. But Adair evaluated the geometry and decided the real value wasn't in finishing a cripple. The real value was in the center, where disruption spread. So he aimed for a bomber in the heart of the group, fired another short burst, and watched the ripple. The aircraft around it moved. The spacing changed, and the escort pattern adjusted again. That was the point. A bomb run was a choreography. He was stepping on the rhythm. The escorts tried to trap him with a coordinated cross. One fighter came in high, trying to force Adair down. Another came in low, trying to catch him if he dove. Adair didn't commit to either direction until the last second. He rolled into a steep dive anyway, trusting the P-40's speed and structure. The high fighter couldn't cut down fast enough. The low fighter was forced into a shot that wasn't clean. Tracers flashed by, close enough that Adair could see their lines, but not close enough to end him. He kept diving. Then came the turn back, a critical decision. If he turned back too early, he'd be predictable. If he stayed away too long, the bombers might regroup. He watched the escort's behavior like a weather pattern, looking for the second they relaxed. When they did, he reversed course and climbed again. If you only see a story like this from the outside, it can look like reckless aggression. Inside the cockpit, it feels more like accounting. Speed, altitude, distance, angles, ammo. Reckless pilots die quickly. Adair stayed alive because he was disciplined. As he climbed, he caught a glimpse of Denjan in the distance, just a suggestion of earth and runway lines through haze. The raid was in the final approach zone. If bombs hit the field, the ground crews would have no defense but luck. Adair needed one more disruption, something big enough to force a final mistake. He set up again from above, using what altitude he had left. The bomber stream was still not stable, but it was trying to settle. Gunners were alert now. Escorts were tighter. This was the most dangerous time to attack, because the enemy was finally organized against him. He attacked anyway. He dove, fired, and pulled away at the last second. The bombers reacted with sudden, uneven movement. Escorts snapped toward him, but their chase was late, because they had been forced to react to bomber motion as well. The sky turned into a mess of intersecting paths, exactly what a bombing formation cannot afford near the target. That mess was Adair's best chance. He had forced the raid to arrive at Denjan in a state of disorder. Even if bombs were released, they would likely be rushed, poorly aligned, or scattered. The raid was no longer a clean strike. It had become a chaotic attempt to finish an objective while being constantly harassed by a single fighter that refused to leave. Adair's role was not to be everywhere. It was to be enough of a problem that the raid could never be comfortable. And he had succeeded. Adair felt the fight tightening. The closer the raid got to Denjan, the less room there was for long chases and wide resets. The bombers needed only a short window of stability to line up and drop. The escorts knew that, so they began prioritizing control over revenge. Instead of everyone chasing him, they formed a tighter screen and waited for him to commit. That was dangerous for Adair, because commitment meant time in the kill zone, time under bomber guns and time inside the escort trap. He adapted by using feints. He started a dive as if he would punch straight into the bombers, forcing the escorts to shift and tighten, then broke off early and climbed away. The trick wasn't to hit every time. The trick was to keep the enemy uncertain enough that they couldn't relax into a clean bombing rhythm. Still, he needed real disruption, not just threats. When he saw an escort drift a little wide, just a small error, he took it. He rolled in from an angle that cut across the bomber stream, fired a short burst at close range, then immediately dove out under the formation. Tracers flashed around him. He didn't stay to confirm damage. He only needed to see the result. The bombers scattered again, spacing broke again, and the formation's timing slipped. The escorts snapped down after him. But Adair stayed fast. The P-40's strength wasn't turning. It was speed in a dive and the ability to absorb punishment. He used that strength brutally. Dive, extend, then climb back, only when he had the distance to do it safely. He was flying a pattern that made him hard to predict and harder to corner. From the ground, Denjan crews would soon see aircraft overhead, either enemy bombers coming in or friendly fighters trying to intercept late. Adair couldn't rely on that. He had to assume he was still alone. So he kept pressing, even as his ammunition dwindled. He made one more close pass, aimed not for a kill, but for panic. He fired into the heart of the bomber group, enough to force evasive action. The bomber line bent and twisted, and the escorts broke their own screen to respond. That reaction mattered more than any single hit. A bombing run cannot be accurate when the aircraft are weaving and the crews are ducking. The raid was still dangerous, but it was no longer clean. Adair had turned a planned strike into a messy, defensive rush. If bombs fell, they would likely be scattered, wasted on empty ground, dropped too early, or released without the alignment needed to hit aircraft and fuel stores. In air defense, that difference is everything. A direct hit can shut a field down. A near miss is noise and dust. Adair stayed with the raid until his fuel and bullets forced a decision. He had delayed it, disrupted it, and pulled escorts away from their ideal positions. Whatever happened next, Denjan would not receive the attack the enemy had intended. One pilot, one fighter, and a refusal to back off had changed the shape of the day. As the enemy aircraft crossed the final distance to Denjan, the situation became a race between confusion and completion. Bombers don't need a perfect formation forever, only long enough to stabilize, aim, and release. The escorts tried to give them that moment by tightening their ring and forcing Adair to keep his distance. Adair could feel the trap forming. If he drove straight at the bombers, he'd be met by converging fighters and crossfire from defensive guns. If he stayed wide, the bombers might finally settle. So he chose a third option. He attacked the edges, where the screen was thinner and reactions were slower. He climbed to regain a little altitude, then rolled down toward a bomber that had drifted slightly outside the main cluster. It was still covered, but not as cleanly. Adair fired a short burst, enough to make the bomber flinch and break its line. That forced nearby aircraft to adjust again. The adjustment spread, small changes stacking into a bigger wobble. The escorts dove after him. Adair didn't try to fight them head-on. He dove hard, using speed to stretch the chase, then reversed direction only when he saw them hesitate. The goal was always the same: keep them reacting, keep them out of position, keep the bombers busy defending themselves instead of aiming. For a moment, he saw what he needed. The bomber stream was no longer on rails. Individual aircraft were weaving. Crews were dumping altitude and correcting. Even if they reached the release point, their bomb pattern would be loose. Adair made one more aggressive approach, close enough that he could see gun positions tracking him. He fired another controlled burst and immediately rolled away. Tracers stitched the air where he had been. He escaped by seconds, but the bombers reacted exactly as he hoped. They shifted again, breaking any attempt to regain a steady run. At that point, the fight wasn't about courage anymore. It was about endurance and decision-making under pressure. Adair had spent his surprise. He had spent most of his ammunition. He had spent fuel. What remained was the impact he'd already created. A raid that arrived at its target late, unsettled, and poorly aligned. If friendly fighters reached Denjon in time, they would face a raid already disrupted, bombers less protected, escorts less organized. If ground defenses opened up, they would be firing into a formation that wasn't clean enough to exploit its own plan. Either way, Denjon's chances were far better than they should have been. Adair finally began to separate from the raid, not because he wanted to, but because every fight has limits. His aircraft could not stay forever. But he left, knowing that he had forced the enemy to spend the most valuable resource in an air raid, precision, on survival, instead. Even after Adair began to pull away, the effects of his harassment lingered. A raid that has been shaken rarely snaps back into perfect discipline at the last second. Pilots are human. Crews remember the last pass, the last tracer line, the last sudden roll that nearly put them into another aircraft. That memory makes hands tighter on controls and decisions faster, not better. The escorts tried to regroup, but they had spent too much time chasing a moving target. Their screen was no longer smooth. Some fighters were low and displaced, others were high, but out of position. The bombers, instead of approaching in neat order, were arriving in small, uneven bunches. That unevenness is poison for accuracy. Bombers rely on timing and spacing. When that collapses, crews are forced to choose between pressing on with a bad setup or aborting and trying again under pressure. In a contested sky, trying again is rarely available. Adair's Warhawk, meanwhile, had paid for every second of disruption. He was running low on ammunition. His fuel situation was tightening, and the stress of constant maneuvering, dives, climbs, high G-pulls, was draining both pilot and machine. A P-40 was rugged, but it was not immune to physics. The engine had been pushed hard. The airframe had been thrown around the sky. Everything that could heat up had heated up. Still, Adair stayed long enough to watch the raid's final behavior. He didn't need to see bombs hit or miss to understand what he'd done. He'd broken formation repeatedly, forced evasive movement, and pulled escorts away from ideal coverage. That meant the raid would not execute as planned. In air defense, not as planned is often the difference between disaster and survivable damage. When he finally turned his attention fully toward returning, the fight didn't feel like a victory lap. It felt like a narrow exit from a burning building. He had been alone in the air against a formation designed to overwhelm. He had survived by discipline and by refusing to surrender the initiative. And whatever the final outcome on the ground, Denjan had been given something priceless: a chance. Back at Denjan, the airfield's survival came down to how much of the raid's precision had been stolen. A bomber strike can be devastating when it's calm and aligned, when crews have time to correct, coordinate, and release on a stable track. What Adair had done was force the opposite: a rushed approach, uneven spacing, and defensive flying where the crew's attention stayed split. That matters because bombs don't home in. They obey physics. If an aircraft is weaving, if altitude is changing, if the release point is guessed instead of measured, the pattern spreads. A spread pattern might crater open ground and throw debris, but it's far less likely to hit the exact targets that shut an airfield down: fuel dumps, parked transports, runway intersections, and maintenance areas. Adair's disruption also affected the escorts. Escorts are supposed to be a disciplined shield, maintaining altitude layers and angles that deny attackers clean routes. But once they've been dragged into repeated chases, their formation becomes reactive. Reactive fighters don't hold perfect positions. They surge and break, then try to rebuild. That rebuilding takes time. Time is exactly what bombers at the target can't afford. When Adair returned to friendly airspace, he wasn't coming back with a neat score. He was coming back with something harder to measure, but more valuable: delay and disorder, imposed on a much larger force. That's not the kind of result that always looks dramatic in a report, but it shows up in what didn't happen, what wasn't destroyed, what wasn't set on fire, what kept operating. In the aftermath, the story spread quickly because it sounded unreal. A single fighter attacking a full raid package goes against instinct. Most people imagine air combat as balanced duels or squadron actions. This was neither. It was a pilot choosing to act when waiting would guarantee harm. And there's another reason it stuck. It showed a mindset that wins in desperate situations. Adair didn't try to fight fair. He didn't accept the enemy's preferred battle: tight turns, coordinated traps, clean lines of approach. He fought the battle his aircraft could support: energy, surprise, hit-and-run pressure, and constant repositioning. He treated the raid like a system that could be destabilized, not like a monster that had to be slain outright. That approach: disrupt the plan, force mistakes, break timing, turns a weaker force into a dangerous one. It's the logic of defense when you can't match numbers. You don't need to erase the enemy. You need to steal their advantage. By the time the day was done, Denjan was still functioning. Transport operations could continue. Crews could repair what was damaged instead of rebuilding from ashes. The supply chain didn't collapse. And that meant countless other missions, unseen, unglamorous, but essential, were still possible. Adair had taken a situation built to overwhelm and made it unstable. He had traded personal risk for operational survival. And that's why, when people later tried to explain what happened in simple terms, they always came back to the same point. One pilot refused to let a raid arrive in peace. Looking back, it's tempting to reduce the story to a headline: one pilot versus a raid. But the real meaning sits in the details. What Adair chose to do with the minutes he had, and what kind of results that choice can create even when the odds look stupid on paper. He didn't win by wiping out the formation. He won by attacking the raid's most fragile requirement: stability. Bombers can carry massive force, but that force is only accurate when the aircraft are calm, aligned, and protected by an escort screen that stays disciplined. Adair made sure the raid was none of those things. He forced the bombers to maneuver defensively. He forced gunners to fire instead of aim. He forced escorts to chase instead of hold position. And every forced reaction stole time, spacing, and precision. That's why disruption is so valuable in air defense. A bomber that drops perfectly can cripple a runway and burn parked aircraft. A bomber that drops in panic often wastes its load on empty ground. The difference is not bravery versus cowardice. It's geometry. It's angles, speed, and release timing. A few degrees off, a few seconds late, a few 100 meters shifted by evasive flight, and a planned strike becomes scattered explosions with far less effect. Adair's own tactics were disciplined, not reckless. He used the P-40's strengths: speed in a dive, durability, and heavy guns, while refusing to fight the enemy's preferred fight. He avoided slow-turning duels. He avoided staying in the bomber gun envelope. He fired in short bursts because ammunition was finite. He kept moving because predictability is death when you're outnumbered. That wasn't luck. It was controlled decision-making under extreme pressure. And that's the part people miss. In moments like this, heroism isn't a speech or a pose. It's choosing the action that gives others a chance, then executing it correctly enough to survive. Adair wasn't thinking about medals in the cockpit. He was thinking about Denyon, runway, transports, fuel, and the people on the ground who would pay the price if the raid arrived undisturbed. When the day ended, what mattered most was what continued. Denyon kept operating. Supplies kept moving. The system didn't collapse. The raid had been forced to fight instead of simply strike. So the story lasts for a simple reason. It proves that even when you can't match numbers, you can still attack the plan. You can still steal timing. You can still create disorder. And in war, disorder is often the first step toward survival. That was the impact of Philip Adair's decision in the early sky over Assam. He didn't let the enemy arrive comfortably. He made them earn every second. And that was enough to change what happened next.